Wilding of Literary University. I would like to acknowledge Professor Bolliser, Associate Professor Wilding, and Associate Professor Marianne Atkins as my PhD supervisors. So this presentation I'll be giving is based on one aspect of filial piety chapter that I wrote. I hope you'll enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to discussions and some of the feedback again. So firstly, I just wanted to provide a bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll first introduce what filial piety is, why a conversation about filial piety is important, and why this concept is actually relevant to my overall PhD on the experience of aging amongst old Chinese Australians. Then I'll introduce the established arguments or the dominant discourses regarding filial piety in the existing literature, and some of the key characteristics that are used to define what constitutes being filial before I highlight some of the gaps in the literature. I will then introduce my research questions, my key findings and arguments before I showcase 2 case study examples to highlight my points. I'll then just touch upon some of the historical origins of filial piety as an ethical discourse, why it's actually important to anchor this ethical framework to daily practices, and why retrospection into history can inform views of change to this practice. Finally, I'll situate my findings in the larger study of my PhD, which is centred on the experience of ageing and homeliness amongst older Chinese Australians, which from here on I'll be calling the Straits Chinese, which refers to Chinese people that came from Malaysia and Singapore. So what is filial piety? Filial piety is basically a system of ethics for moral social conduct that's indigenous to China and developed by Confucius in the 6th century BCE. Filial piety forms part of a broader system of ethics that was developed by Confucius that has served as guiding principles for social behaviour and a criteria for judging right and wrong. Now, filial piety isn't a new topic in academic research, and many scholars have examined this subject in the context of migration studies, philosophy, and family care planning. Conversations about filial piety also have relevance in popular culture, where news articles pertaining to this Eastern practice of care is occasionally visited. So, in the Dateline article you see above that was published through SBS last year, the author spoke about the potential of integrating this Eastern philosophy of care in Australia to offset growing pressures on the Australian aged care system. In cinematic entertainment, we have seen movies such as Filial, which is based off a Confucian fable about a virtuous daughter that fulfills filial piety by taking her father's place in the army. More recently, we have seen a release of a cartoon by Disney that was set in a fictitious universe that tells the story about a young Southeast Asian girl on a journey to restore her homeland, reunite nations, and bring her father back to life. So yeah, it may involve dragons and magical stones, but the underlying parable is about one's allegiances to family and kinsfolk, which are core values rooted in filial piety. However, this conversation about filial piety is also important in the more intimate and private sanctum of the family that is lived and experienced amongst those that come from a culture that have historically embraced this moral standing of care. The topic continues to have relevance and forms an important part of my research into aged care and sense of homeliness amongst the Straits Chinese living in Australia. While often unpaid and rarely touched upon in public policy, the family continues to serve a really important role in shaping the experience of aging. So garnering a deeper understanding of what filial care expectations looks like in the Australian context not only allows us to understand that filial piety continues to have relevance, but also how it informs the lived experiences of the elderly Straits Chinese in Australia and their families. So, what are the established arguments put forward in the context of globalisation and migration studies is that filial piety has become rooted amongst the Chinese, or more broadly, Asian families as adult children increasingly embrace Western doctrines of care. So this made me question if this was a phenomenon that was also occurring amongst the Straits Chinese in Australia. The dominant discourse about filial piety is that it's rigid, it's an authoritarian system of care to be followed without question. Drawing upon Sung's research into filial piety, she argued that there were measurable characteristics linked to this practice. And the characteristics that she identified aligned with many of the other authors that explored this topic. So these measurable characteristics included showing respect and worthiness, repaying the debt owed, sacrifice for the benefit of one's collective, reverence and family harmony. Parker Kim also took a cross-cultural comparison between Chinese families living in Asia to those living in the West, and noted that filial piety is channeled through two streams, being socio-economic and passive emotional. They also noted that there's a clear gender divide in the provision of care and acknowledged that the flow of care can be balanced. Now, while examining and testing out these measurable characteristics may help to determine expressions of filial piety, what tends to be overlooked is that filial piety is a structural framework designed to promote and maintain social harmony. The fulfillment of filial piety is more than a simple tick-off list of an arbitrary list of characteristics. It is a practice that actually works in tandem with other ethical protocols that forms part of the broad schema of Confucian law on family, which includes ancestor worship, the importance of family continuity, and the meaning of kinsfolk to sustain and maintain interpersonal harmony. I argue that placing too much emphasis on the traditional characteristics linked to filial piety can actually run the risk of losing focus on the purpose behind this ancient practice and treat filial piety as the be-all and end-all. So this brings me to my research questions. The first being, is filial piety still relevant and practiced by the Straits Chinese in Australia, or has it been eroded? Do contemporary lived experiences and narratives differ from the orthodox version founded by Confucius? How is the literature evaluating this, and what do my findings contribute to this discussion? And lastly, how does examining filial piety contribute towards a better understanding of aged care practices amongst the Straits Chinese? How does this inform their experiences of holiness in Australia? So, demonstrated through two case studies that I've chosen for this presentation, I argue that filial piety remains an enduring practice amongst the Straits Chinese. While the practice is no longer the authoritative or the structural version taught under Orthodox Confucianism, this does not mean that filial piety is eroded. Secondly, I argue that filial piety itself is not the supreme goal, but merely a framework to ensure that interpersonal harmony can be maintained between family members, a point that is not made in the literature. And to appreciate this, researchers must consider the wider teachings of Confucianism beyond the measurable characteristics, because it is more than just an authoritarian system of care. It draws upon other customs embedded in Chinese and more broadly East Asian culture, including ancestor worship, and understanding the importance of family continuity and extended kinship networks in the makeup of the Chinese collective consciousness. So, in the Australian context, maintaining consistent, reliable, and regular concern is a dimension of how the Straits Chinese express filial piety. This practice is understood and accepted as a positive expression of filial piety amongst the order participants. Although it may not actually mirror the strict characteristics defined under Orthodox Confucianism, I argue that this transformation, this ancient practice, does not mark it as being eroded or somehow less authentic, but rather a change to maintain its relevance amongst Chinese households. And to appreciate this, we do need to adopt a processual definition of culture that recognises that cultures are dynamic and is transformative in the migration context. So, I'd now like to introduce Uncle SL and Auntie GL for my first case study. So, they're an elderly couple aged in their 70s that migrated from Malaysia to Perth back in the 1980s with their kids. They live in a 4-bedroom property in the northern suburbs of Perth and is in regular contact with their adult kids. Their children are now adults, they're married, and they've started their own nuclear families. Now, even though the kids don't live with Uncle SL and Auntie GL, both of them believe that their children are filial and continue to practice filial piety, despite not following the orthodox version founded under Confucius. Auntie GL said, "My daughter comes to visit us every Friday night and would occasionally stay overnight. It is a time when we update each other about our week, but also a chance for us to raise any matters we need help with. Usually, if we need our daughter to book an appointment, she will do it and then call us to see how the appointment went." And when I asked them about their views about cohabitation, which is perhaps one of the more conservative practices under filial piety, Auntie GL said, "Although it would be nice if my kids asked me to move in with them, I don't think I would accept the offer. My children's generation is different from ours, and I think we would end up arguing all the time. I might consider it if I can no longer look after myself, but until then, we're happy alone." Introduced to the next case study is Auntie MT. She's in her 80s and lives in a small apartment in the city within Perth. So Auntie MT has 1 daughter and 3 sons, one of whom lives in Singapore. Her husband passed away several years ago, but she tells me that she's quite happy living alone. So when I spoke to Auntie about whether her kids care for her, she said this: "My English is not very good, and whenever I need help translating a letter or to organise an appointment, my daughter always comes and helps me. My daughter is also the primary contact for Silver Chain, which is a home care service provider. So whenever I need Silver Chain to help me with something, just let my daughter know and she will sort it out." Speaking to Auntie MT about her views on possibly moving in with her daughter rather than living alone, she preferred to avoid this for reasons. She has 3 young children and it would be overcrowded living together. I would have to share a room with my granddaughter. Why would I move in with them if I have my own space in my own apartment? I like to listen to Chinese opera, play the herbal, and go dancing with friends. If I stay with them, I think her husband and children would complain about me being too noisy." So, just drawing from these 2 case studies, some common narratives did emerge. In both case studies, when I asked the participants if their children were filial, they agreed that how their children express care is a form of filial piety. So to this extent, the practice of filial piety is an enduring practice that the Straits Chinese continue to engage in Australia. Now, while Auntie GL and Auntie MT's children do not actually engage in hands-on domestic service on a daily basis, which is commonly associated with the more orthodox practices of filial piety, the elderly participants were able to easily cite examples of their children, making themselves available to help them whenever needed. And so to this extent, the older participants considered their kids filial. The second emergent narrative is that this desire to maintain or restore interpersonal harmony within the family is the most important priority. In the first case study, Auntie GL noted that moving in with her daughter's family might result in arguments that would destabilise the peaceful relationship that they currently have. So with this ability to still look after themselves and a home to live in, she saw no reason to change the status quo. The same can be said about Auntie MT. She highlighted that her hobbies as a potential cause of friction with her daughter's family. And this for her is not worth taking for the sake of preserving good relationships. The third point is that it's really important to embrace a more processual interpretation of culture rather than essentialist interpretation. From the older person's perspective, their benchmark of what constitutes being filial has changed with the times and socioeconomic conditions. As discussed earlier, care may not involve this domestic service on a daily basis, but it's also important that this is not what the aging participants want or need at this stage in their life. The filial piety as a practice of care is quite dynamic and sensitive to external change. This brings me to my fourth point, that how adult children demonstrate filial piety is more centered on being reliable, dependable, and consistent in whatever routine embraced in each respective household. In the case of Uncle SL and Auntie GL's daughter, they said that their daughter will visit every Friday night to check on them and to see where she can be of assistance. Similarly, Auntie Auntie's daughter is always available and willing to run errands for her to help. So drawing on my findings that filial piety is a practice that is responsive and sensitive to change, it's important to consider the role of social welfare, because the type of welfare model countries adopt can also inform how families interpret and practice filial piety. So the East Asian model that's found in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and perhaps other countries around the Indo-Pacific bloc is quite different from the traditional welfare model of the West. Malaysia and Singapore embrace a more productivist welfare regime, where economic policies are prioritised over social policies. So this regime is based on the idea of the trickle-down theory of development, the notion that economic growth will eventually benefit the whole population and the overall standards of living. In Malaysia, for example, only government workers are offered subsidised healthcare schemes and tax-funded on welfare. Those that occupy, I guess, unstable employment often become the most financially vulnerable in later life and therefore heavily dependent on their adult children to survive. This practice of cohabitation between aging parents and adult children, which is actually quite common in Malaysia, is more of a necessity rather than a choice. Now, while Australia isn't a universal welfare state, the country does have some social security safety nets that heavily means tested to protect the most vulnerable. We also have a universal healthcare system and a pharmaceutical benefit scheme that alleviates the pressures of families that cannot afford the medical care that their aging parents need. So really, depending on the type of welfare system each country adopts, and hence the gaps in care that must be filled, it directly influences the standards and the benchmarks of what constitutes being filial. Secondly, the type of public resources available to older people will also directly inform filial care expectations that aging parents will have of their adult children. So, filial piety is responsive to change, is also supported from, I guess, a historical standpoint. Towards the end of the Qing dynasty and after the fall of imperial China, the nation endured mass poverty, overpopulation, and starvation, and obviously a decimated political system of government. And this led to a mass exodus of people, mostly from southern China to the Straits of Malaya. They were essentially desperate to seek a better life, and most of these early immigrants were able-bodied single men. The process of immigration out of China disrupted access to kin support to these new migrants. They were no longer living in the same villages, and these new migrants found it increasingly difficult to maintain this traditional family institution and associated practices. But this actually didn't mark the end of filial piety as a cultural practice in Malaysia or Singapore. They adapted and reinvented the meaning of kin support and the practice of filial piety in the new frontier. Local clans, known as gongsis, which you see up here, they were created to establish new kinship ties amongst the fellow migrants, and they were based on either having a shared common language or last name. Other organisations were also founded on a shared religious affiliation, such as the Chinese Sworn Brotherhood in Penang, which is kind of like the equivalent of stonemason in Australia. And so this organisation brought together individuals amongst the Chinese into like a quasi-kinship system. Some filial piety endured based on having allegiances and loyalties to one's gongsis or religious clans until such time that these immigrants planted roots and resumed filial practices within their own households. Even in contemporary times, the Confucian system of ethics continues to remain the standard of morality in the Straits settlement. In Singapore, for example, the government introduced the shared values policy in 1991 to solidify the nation's identity and core value system. And these values included prioritising the nation before the community and society before self. Family is deemed to be the basic unit of society, where the elderly and the children are to be taken care of. Community support and respect for the individual is important, along with the promotion of harmony over conflict and fostering racial and religious harmony. However, these shared values are not actually based on this strict hierarchy of responsibility between family members taught under Orthodox Confucianism. Instead, the shared values embrace the concept of having equal responsibility. So even from a historical standpoint, we see that filial piety has always been responsive to change to suit the economic climate of the time. History also has relevance in affirming my argument that filial piety is more than a simple tick-off list of authoritative characteristics without question. The intention of this ancient practice was to restore and maintain interpersonal harmony between kin rather than the goal in itself. Filial piety was founded by Confucius in the 6th century BCE, which situates it in the Zhou dynasty. This was a really turbulent period in China's history. It was a country that was consumed by warfare and territorial conflict, also known as the Warring States period. During this period, no warlord or ruler was able to claim the right to rule in ancient China, because the right to rule was actually more than just about conquest and military domination. It was also about claiming the mandate from heaven or the right to rule the blessing from God. Confucius, having seen the destruction of endless warfare, developed a system of ethics to bring stability to China. Unlike the mysticism surrounding the need to gain the blessing from God, Confucius developed a more worldly approach based on following moral infrastructure to guide social conduct and behaviour. His philosophical approach was focused more on the relationships between people as applicable to all tiers of social class. So the Confucian system of ethics appealed and met the needs of society during this period of disunion, and Confucianism became embedded in the fabric of Chinese social order. The system was embraced because it was effective at maintaining interpersonal harmony in society. So, although the practice of filial piety may have changed to suit the needs of Chinese families over time and space, filial piety continues to have relevance through the process of reinvention and cultural transformation, because it serves a higher goal, which is to maintain and restore interpersonal harmony between kin and maintain the family unit as a bedrock of society. So you may be asking, how is any of this relevant? What's the relevance of this continuing re-examination of filial piety, and whether it still exists, and how this actually fits into my PhD on aging and homelessness? And my answer to this question is that the experience of aging can be greatly influenced by family and close kin. With increased age comes the greater need to draw upon assistance from others to maintain your independence. So when you consider older people that may come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, such as the participants interviewed for my research, their adult children are actually an extremely important node between the aging parents and their ability to tap into publicly and privately available resources. So garnering this understanding of whether filial piety is still practiced by the Straits Chinese in Australia, and how it is practiced, allows us to more easily identify where the gaps exist in the ability to deliver appropriate care support to migrants, as well as having a clearer understanding of what role the state can play in supporting not just the older people, but also the family members, delivering often unpaid and sometimes unrecognised care support. And that's the end of my presentation.